So there's a lot of conversation right now about whether the format we're currently in is good or bad. Personally, I haven't been playing a lot of high level Yu-Gi-Oh to know, but from the amount that I've been able to go to locals and be able to sort of play against some of the decks that are good right now, I will say that it is really difficult to plan for a lot of things and for skill expression to feel like it sort of determined games. And I think the question that a lot of people are really sort of wrestling with is whether this format is healthy. And I think that for some people, their idea of a healthy format boils down to diversity, and that's it. And for other people, the health of a format mostly comes down to just whether you enjoy it or not. And those aren't really deterministic of whether a format is healthy or not. There's a few sort of core components to what makes up a format's health. And I think right now we're probably in a format that could arguably be called unhealthy. And that's weird because traditionally formats that are really diverse tend to be pretty healthy formats. The problem with this format isn't the fact that there's too many decks, though. That's not the issue. What the issue boils down to is the fact that not only are there a lot of decks that are viable right now, but those decks all operate on such different axes that preparing for the format is really difficult. In addition to that, once you get into the peripheries of the format, sort of the decks that exist just outside of the established metagame, they really can't compete anywhere close to the same level as the decks that are good. And the fact is that if you're playing a deck that's rogue, the gap between your deck and even a deck that's like tier 2 is massive in terms of consistency, power, recoverability, flexibility. Decks that were once considered just some of the strongest decks that could ever exist have mostly been eclipsed. And even decks that have existed historically at the same time, and I mean historically like a couple years ago, like take for example Tearlament and Sprite. The gap in power between Tearlament and Sprite when those decks were new was not very big. In fact, they alternated which deck was the best based on, you know, what was happening within a given metagame. You know, a tournament would come up and are people over prepared for tier or are they over prepared for Sprite? Whichever one people were prepared for less, that deck had a better chance of doing better. But as it is right now, the fact is that Tearlament is just a vastly better deck. Even after all the hits on the ban list, even after losing Kit Kalos, that deck is one of the strongest decks right now. And it's difficult to quantify why exactly, because current day tier doesn't play all that differently from the tier of yesteryear. I think that the addition of the Ishizu cards, even though they're kind of nerfed at this point, and the fact that a lot of cards have been hit in tier, the fact is that just the existence of these Shizu cards at all drastically raises the ceiling on Tearlament. And a lot of cards have been printed that just make Tearlament an easier deck to play. You know, the existence of the new Horus cards and the ability to go into something like the zombie rank 8 that lets you mill cards, and then also having access to things like malicious to be able to go into easy sixes, overlay for a Beatrice, and then get your plays going. Like, those are all things that make the deck way more consistent. And the deck just has the ability to play through a lot of interaction, and it has the ability to play through interactions that Sprite just doesn't have the ability to play through. And if you look at some of the other decks that have sort of propelled themselves forward, if you're looking at a deck like, let's take for example Rescue Ace. Rescue Ace is a really strong deck right now, and the fact is that it has not only exists within a very diverse metagame, but itself is a deck that has a diverse array of different builds you can play. You can play different lines within the deck. And the fact is that Rescue Ace doesn't necessarily use its extra deck super often. So like there are spots within the extra deck that sort of exist as flex spots, and they have the ability to play a lot of very interesting techs in the extra deck, things that sort of smooth over scenarios that might be more difficult to deal with for other decks. Like the ability of Rescue Ace to play things like Hita means that they can extend further, but you also have things like the ability to play some of the Salamangreat links. Like when I played against Rescue Ace in one of the local matches that I had, I ended up getting some of my board dismantled because my opponent was able to go into a Helio and spin my back row away, right? And the fact is like you can go into things like Phoenix, you can go into things like Helio, you can even go into things like Puzzlemino and do the whole Ibly combo. There's also a line that you can do that goes through what's it called? The Isolde, and then goes into the new Infernoble level 1 and does a bunch of crazy stuff with that. But like those aren't even the only versions of the deck that are viable. You could play versions that don't even really go into the extra deck at all, because Turbulence set 4 is just so strong. And it's if your opponent's able to resolve the effect of Turbulence, then you're fighting an uphill battle unless you have the ability to wipe their board before they have a chance to activate anything. But again, you're in a diverse metagame, and even within the diversity of decks, the individual decks have a diversity among the different builds that you can play. And that leaves, Unchained is one of the other decks that's really strong. I mean, the finals for the most recent YCS was an Unchained mirror. And that deck is insane because, because of the new support that they got, and because of the fact that, like, the deck is sort of built around, generically being able to work with fiends, there's a lot of cards that go super hard in that deck that would not go as hard in other decks. And the fact that they have access to the DDD rank 6, and then you can also play a more robust DDD package in that deck. Play things like the Scale, the Dark Contract, put in the Deus Ex in the extra deck. Like, you have options. And again, this creates a scenario where not only is the actual list of decks that are viable diverse, but the builds of those individual decks are also diverse, which then creates an even wider breadth of decks that you need to be familiar with. And it makes a scenario where things like, so let me put it to you this way. When I was playing against Horus, what was it? It was a build of Horus, and they went into the zombie vampire and they were going to mill me, and they said, let's get some information on what you're playing. The fact is that even if you get information on what cards are in the main deck, unless you hit very specific cards out of the deck, it's very possible that you know what deck your opponent's playing, but not what build of the deck your opponent's playing. And that could be a bit of a problem because depending on what options they have in the extra deck, that can vastly change what sort of plays for your deck are optimal. And so that really makes it difficult to play at like a very high level. But in addition to that, for decks that have one specific build and that's the only build that they play, things like milling off of one of the Ishizu cards or milling off of the zombie vampire can suddenly give away all the information about your deck that's available. You know, I played Sprite, and there are builds of the deck. There are different builds. You can play the adventure build, you can play the live twin build, you can even play like the Tri Brigade build. So like Sprite is one of those decks that has a diversity of builds. But my mills that I got off of it basically gave away the entire game because it milled a starter and it milled one of the live twin cards, which gives away the fact that I'm playing that build of Sprite. So not only do they know I'm playing Sprite, but they know what build I'm playing. And for decks like Rescue Ace, where what build you're playing is contingent on slots in the extra deck, not slots in the main deck, that can be a huge boost to your ability to be able to bluff your opponent. So, all of that to say that in this format specifically, the diversity of the format is actually working against it in a lot of ways. I think that it's cool that there's a lot of viable decks and a lot of viable builds of each of those decks, but from a deck building perspective, it makes it extremely difficult to build a side deck. Like what do you put in your side deck to be able to deal with all of these different builds of all of these different decks? Like there are cards that are generically good against a lot of matchups. But the fact is that some cards that you bring in may be good against one build of the deck you're playing, but not good against a different build. Like, take for example something like Dimension Shifter. There are certain decks that Dimension Shifter just completely hoses. A specific deck like Sprite historically played Dimension Shifter in the side deck. But Dimension Shifter is a card that also goes super hard against the Tri Brigade build. If you're playing the Tri Brigade build of this deck, then you have a basically 50% chance that your hand is going to be unplayable because the Tri Brigades require the use of the graveyard. All of their effects trigger by being sent to the graveyard, and their cheat out effect requires you to banish stuff from the grave. How are you going to get stuff in the grave if everything's getting banished, right? But if your opponent shifters you and you're playing any of the other builds of Sprite, odds are you're fine, right? You might lose access to some resources. You might lose access to the ability to use certain cards like Smashers. At least you can use it, but you can't use it like profitably, right? And that's fine. But, you know, that's a toss-up as to whether that card's actually good in this matchup. And if your opponent has full knowledge, then they can make a more informed decision. But, you know, going blind into something, like if your opponent just like scoops before giving you any information, or if like you milled them off of like a Guido or a zombie vampire, and you know they're playing Sprite, but you didn't mill anything but Sprite cards and generic staples, then, you know, it's a toss-up as to whether what they're playing is going to be hit by certain cards, right? And like certain decks have the ability to play around certain cards depending on the line that they go for. Like once I get into games 2 and 3 with Sprite, I'm probably going to be going into a carrot because people are going to be siding things like Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched against me. I had a guy double evenly me, even though I had a carrot on field. I got hosed, right? But I was still able to play because of the live twin cards. Like, having the live twin Kill on field meant that I could reborn the Lilla to get a pop, and then I also had an action hand. So it's like, even after getting even lead, I still had 2 pieces of interaction, right? But a lot of decks are like that. Like, if you evenly something like a Pearly, they just keep the Noir, right? If you evenly something like Rescue Ace, maybe they keep like a back row that can summon a guy, and then that guy can search a guy, and then that guy's a piece of interaction. Suddenly you're having to deal with like a couple points of interaction all off a single card. Same thing for, Unchained. Just keep the rank 6 that has 2 negates on him. Or keep the Link monster that allows you to link someone using your opponent's monsters. Or keep the card that reborns a Unchained monster from Grave. Like, you have options as to what you can do, right? So these cards don't necessarily win you the game automatically, which is good. I mean, I don't think people want to like get even lead and then feel like they had absolutely no way of being able to sort of continue the game past that. Like, the idea is you want to simplify the board state. You don't want to necessarily like win instantly, although some people do, but that's neither here nor there. But the other problem, aside from just like the deep levels of diversity in the format, making it difficult to deck build, making it difficult to plan, in addition to that, the decks that are currently good, they go extremely wide, and they can play through a lot of pieces of interaction. Like, Unchained does kind of lose to Nibiru, but they have cards that allow them to extend past the point where Nibiru can be used, because the last point you can use Nibiru is when they have the 2 6s on field and are about to go into the DDD Xyz. And if you Nibiru them at that point, there's a good chance that they have stuff in hand that they can just keep playing the game, right? So the same is true of Rescue Ace. Like, if you Nibiru them at the wrong time, like, or even if you Nibiru them after their combo's all over, they may have been sitting on some things that allow them to continue playing, right? And Nibiru does not stop the back row. Like, you have to preemptively Nibiru before they have a chance to activate Turbulence's effect. If you allow them to resolve Turbulence, Nibiru's not going to do anything. And a lot of other decks have the ability to set up negates before Nibiru happens. But, like, the fact is that unless you draw very specific outs, a lot of the turn 1 boards for Rescue Ace, for Unchained, for Pearly to a certain extent, for, a lot of the decks that are really good right now, their turn 1 is so potent that losing the die roll is basically like game determinative, right? And if you lose the die roll, there's like a huge chance that you're just going to lose game 1. And it gets to the point where like scooping before you even try to break the board becomes optimal so that you can try and give them as little information as possible. But it also becomes a situation where a lot of them over the course of their combo, they have the opportunity to mill cards from your deck too. So, do you allow that to happen and give them information, or do you just scoop them up and go to game 2? Because then you're on the back foot, right? So not only is the format diverse, but it feels very die roll dependent. And those two things are things that typically are signs that the format's not very good. Like, diversity is usually a good thing, but like a format being difficult to deck build for, and then a format being die roll dependent, are usually signs that the decks that are good right now are not healthy decks. But let's look at it from a different perspective. I played a lot of competitive Pokemon in high school, and one of the terms that came up a lot was sort of when the metagame becomes centralized. Right now, the metagame is heavily centralized around a couple new cards that have come out that are basically in every deck. Like, I had to pick up a copy of SP Little Knight in order to play at the tournament. And that card came up constantly. Like, it was a really strong card. Being a really strong IP target and being a recurring point of interaction, basically being better DPE to a certain extent, like, it was really strong, right? And some games I won off the back of it. Other games, it wasn't quite enough to win on its own. But as part of a larger strategy, it raises the ceiling for a lot of these decks. And the same goes for Typhon. Like, I've yet to see what Typhon looks like when it's at full power, right? Being used optimally. But from what I've collected from people within the community, recently it's been proven that Typhon is maybe more game determinative than SP. Possibly. It could just be people coping, but it is a really strong card. You know, it's a floodgate and it's a way to sort of, you know, keep pushing after a lot of your interaction has been dealt with. So I get why people are saying that it's really good. I mean, I agree that it's really good. I mean, I knew it was really good pretty much from the moment that it got revealed. You can go watch the video I made about it back when it got revealed if you want to hear more about that. But the fact is that if you're not playing these cards, then you're at a disadvantage. And so the fact that, like, deck building is really hard to do, the fact that, like, games are mostly determined by the die roll right now, and the fact that the metagame is sort of centralized around these very specific, honestly very expensive cards right now, means that the format is not in the greatest of places in terms of its health. So for a lot of the people saying that the format's bad, I don't necessarily know if it's bad, but I will definitely say that it doesn't feel as rewarding of a format to build for, to play in, or to talk about as formats of the past have been. And I don't know what it's going to take for that to change. I could maybe see like a ban list happening that could change that. Maybe sort of, you know, push out some of the decks that are, you know, causing things to be a little too difficult to plan for, or new product coming in that either makes the cards that are currently centralizing the metagame a little cheaper, like maybe an unlimited run of Age of Overlord in a few months, or a new archetype comes out that doesn't need SP Little Knight and can compete at a top competitive level without having to spend $100 on an extra deck card, possibly multiple if, you know, you're playing certain decks and certain builds of decks. Like I mentioned, the Isolde line in Rescue Ace, that version of the deck has to play 2 copies of SP, one to be able to make Isolde, and then the second one to have as interaction on their opponent's turn. So, you know, it's a bit of, you know, juggling that you have to do to try and figure out how to fix the format, and that's not my job. It's not. But what I can say is that I don't think a ban list is going to fix things. There are some things that I think a ban list would help. I do think that there are some cards that should probably go. Or some cards that could come back that would shake things up. I don't really necessarily think that like a ban list would do a whole lot to change the situation that we're in. But I do think that maybe either printing some decks that again, don't use SP Little Knight, or maybe reprinting Little Knight earlier than they might otherwise, just to try and get more copies of it out there, try and drive the price down. Now, if they do like an ulti printing or like a ghost printing or something, or like a 25th quarter century secret rare printing that's like chase card in a set, that's not going to fix the price problem, right? But like, again, even an unlimited run of Agov would probably fix a lot of issues, right? But that's difficult to say. Either way, I'm still gonna play, like Pac said on Twitter. Even though the format's bad, I'm still gonna, show up, still play some games, try and make Sprite as good as I can for the current format. And in the meantime, if you enjoyed the video, hit that subscribe button and maybe go check out some of my other videos. I'll see you guys later.